So, hello everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out to today's event, which we're calling Our Rights and a Livable Future or a Livable World. So, I just want to give a special thanks to the provincial and federal parliamentarians joining us today and to our distinguished panel of guest speakers. So, my name is Vanessa, and this is my co host, Mary Blake, and we're both volunteers at Citizens Climate Lobby Canada.
And Vanessa has actually been volunteering with Citizens Climate Lobby since she was 16, which is very impressive. We'd also just like to thank Kathy Orlando, who put this all together, and she's currently behind the scenes making sure all the tech works. So thank you for everything you do, Kathy. So Citizens Climate Lobby Canada is a volunteer-driven and nonpartisan organization. Since 2010, we have built political will for a livable planet by empowering individuals to have breakthroughs in their personal and political power. To date, we have 42 active chapters covering over 120 ridings across the country and have met with government officials over 1,500 times in the past 12 years.
Great. So before we get into the presentations, we just wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. So Citizens Climate Lobby acknowledges Indigenous peoples throughout Canada as traditional owners and custodians of the land. This includes Inuit, Métis, and more than 900,000 people living in more than 630 First Nations communities and in cities and towns across these lands. So their traditional knowledge must be significantly incorporated as part of meaningful action on the climate crisis.
So just two things to keep in mind before we get started. First, this event is being recorded, and if all goes well, it will be posted online. And second, please do remember that this is a nonpartisan event. So with that being said, today's event will be a panel discussion. You will hear from each of our guest speakers, and then there will be time for parliamentarians to ask questions. CCL attendees, you will be able to talk when we go into breakout sessions afterward. With that, Vanessa can introduce our first speaker.
Yes, so hope you are all as excited as I am to acquire the information that these wonderful speakers have and are going to share today. So our first speaker is Dr. David Boyd. So he is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. He's also a professor at UBC, and he's an environmental optimist. So before starting, Dr. David Boyd, we wanted to congratulate you on Bill S5, which is strengthening the Canadian Environmental Protection Act of 1999 and for recognizing a right to a healthy environment. So it is actually being passed into law this week. So thank you for your work as a Blue Dot Movement spokesperson.
Super, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be joining you all today. I'm on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people. And I don't think anybody here will be surprised to learn that we are in the midst of an unprecedented global climate crisis. We are already 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial average temperature. And at 1.2 degrees, which is a small number, the impacts are large. I mean, extreme weather events, floods, droughts, heat waves, rising sea levels, acidification, deoxygenation of the oceans, all of these impacts are already happening at 1.2 degrees. A study released last week indicated that we are now highly likely to pass 1.5 degrees, which was the ambitious target in the Paris Agreement. We're going to pass 1.5 within the next 5 years. So that's very daunting because every fraction of a degree makes a difference. And I'm mostly going to be talking about a global perspective here, and then other speakers will focus on Canada. So we're at 1.2, we're headed for 1.5 in the next 5 years. The other Paris target is 2.0 degrees, and we are not on track to meet that target. That target would result in even more frequent and severe extreme weather events and the complete disappearance of ecosystems such as coral reefs around our planet. We are currently on track for 2.7 degrees of warming, which is assuming all states meet their current climate commitments, which is a very large and probably unrealistic assumption. So this, and I'll just very briefly say that one of the real privileges of being the United Nations Special Rapporteur is that I do these country missions across the world. So in the past 5 years, I've been to Fiji, where I visited one of the first communities in the world that had to be completely relocated because of sea level rise and contamination of their farmlands and drinking water. I went to Norway, where I met with indigenous Sami people north of the Arctic Circle, whose traditional culture and livelihoods are based on reindeer herding. But it now rains in the winter in northern Norway, and reindeer simply cannot scrape away the layers of ice that are forming. And so there's mass starvation of reindeer in northern Norway. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a small island state in the Caribbean, I spoke to farmers who say it's absolutely unbearable now during the day to work in their fields. In Kenya, I met with pastoralists whose life savings are represented by the cattle they have. And those cattle are dying because of severe and prolonged droughts. In Portugal last year, 1,000 people died in a heat wave. And I met people who survived these extreme wildfires in 2017 that burned hundreds of thousands of hectares. And just last month, I was in Chile, a country which has been in drought for more than 15 years, and a country whose future is really in jeopardy because of severe water shortages. So that's just a quick world tour. And to say that Canada, as a major greenhouse gas emitter, is contributing to the problems faced in all of these countries. The climate crisis is also a human rights crisis. It is affecting the right to life, the right to health, the right to food, the right to water, the rights of the child, cultural rights, and the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So that's the first couple of things I wanted to mention. And now I want to talk about international environmental law, because it's been 31 years since the nations of the world agreed on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in those 31 years, after agreeing to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the Earth's climate system, greenhouse gas emissions have actually gone up more than 60%. Coal use is up, oil use is up, natural gas use is up. And most shockingly, more greenhouse gas emissions have been emitted since the Framework Convention on Climate Change was negotiated than in all of human history prior to that time. And what are the consequences when a country like Canada, which has never met any of its climate commitments, there are no consequences. There are no accountability mechanisms in international environmental law. So the situation is quite dire. And I want to just, time is very short, I'm going to say three things which are actually bits of encouraging news. The first is that last year, the United Nations recognized that everyone, everywhere, has the right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, a human right which Canada voted for at the GA and which has just been recognized, as Valerie mentioned, in the amendments to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So Canada is now one of the 160 countries around the world that recognizes the right to a healthy environment in law. And courts are making a big difference in this fight for climate action. Courts are, and they're doing so by using human rights. So we have these amazing decisions from the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, from the Constitutional Court of Germany, from the highest administrative court in France, which are forcing governments to take more ambitious climate action, which are finally delivering the accountability that people have been searching for over 30 years in the climate context. As well as those courts that I mentioned in Europe, there are really powerful decisions coming out of Latin American courts. The Supreme Court of Brazil, the Supreme Court of Colombia, the Supreme Court of Mexico have all made really important climate decisions based on governments failing to fulfill their citizens' right to a healthy environment. Just a few months ago, the Supreme Court of Hawaii, where the state constitution has the right to a healthy environment, the Supreme Court of Hawaii struck down the permits for a power plant that would have burned biomass. One of those false green solutions. And so courts are stepping up. Courts also at the global level, there's a really important decision from the UN Human Rights Committee about adaptation, finding that Australia had violated the rights of Indigenous Torres Strait Islanders by failing to protect them from the impacts of climate change. There are cases ongoing at the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And so this is an encouraging trend. And the third and final bit of good news is just that we are in the midst of an extraordinary renewable energy revolution. The cost of generating electricity from solar has fallen 90% in the last decade or so. Wind, the cost is down by 70%. And so renewables are now the cheapest form of power in almost every country in the world, including Canada, I would add. And Just to put that in context, 20 years ago, the global total of solar electricity generating capacity was 1 gigawatt. And the world's leading energy experts, the International Energy Agency, said that if countries put in place the right policies and businesses invested, we could have 7 times as much solar by the year 2020. Well, we went so far past that. Instead of having 7 gigawatts of solar, we now have over 1,000. China adds more than the projected global total, 7 gigawatts every month to their system. So there is no longer any need for fossil fuels to generate electricity. And it's critical that as we move forward, if we want to protect human rights, if we want to have a sustainable and just future, we have to phase out fossil fuels, end deforestation, and transform industrial agriculture. I see my time is up, so I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing my other guest speakers, and to the questions coming up.
Well, thank you very much, David. Our next speaker is Andrew Gage, the climate change lead at West Coast Environmental Law and Sue Big Oil.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for being here. Yeah, I'm speaking to you about the Sue Big Oil campaign, and more fundamentally, the importance of there being accountability to those who profit most from the fossil fuel economy. So David mentioned the fact that half of the global greenhouse gas emissions in the course of human history have occurred since the world's governments of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change agreed to get greenhouse gas emissions under control. And I think we have to ask ourselves why, because if we can't answer that question, we're going to make the same mistakes. We are not going to make the shifts we need to with the speed we need to. And fortunately, a group of academics a couple of years back came together and examined that question through a variety of different lenses, concluding that in every case, the answer to that question is power. And although not only, certainly including and in particular the power of the fossil fuel industry and the deeply entrenched economic interests that go with it. So if we're going to bend that curve, we need tools that challenge the profits of those who benefit from the fossil fuel economy. Currently, we have a situation where the profits of the fossil fuel economy are kept entirely separate from the costs. And as long as that's the case, we have an industry that appears to be hugely profitable and who makes business decisions and whose investors and the governments that support them make these business decisions that prioritize short-term profits over the health of our communities and our planet. We've actually seen that just recently. There's, of course, a whole history of industry investing in climate denial, in misleading the public, in lobbying against climate action. But just recently, with massive profits, companies that actually have been making commitments around climate change have put on the brakes because they are making too much money from fossil fuels. And that's going to continue as long as this industry takes no responsibility for the harm caused by their products. It's a classic externality, the polluter pays principle. And that translates into specific harm for our communities. And to any elected officials on this call, I mean, you have to ask yourself, how can my taxpayers, how can the residents of Canada or my province or my local government continue to pay these costs, which are going to continue to rise? We're already in the billions of dollars of dealing with these impacts. Well, none of the costs are paid by the industries that are most responsible in making the profits. It would be fiscally irresponsible just to pass those costs on to taxpayers without looking for tools to hold those industries accountable. So why the Sue Big Oil campaign? I mean, obviously the name says what we're trying to do. We are asking BC local governments to come together in a class action lawsuit against global fossil fuel companies. We're doing that because it is a way of directly challenging that separation of the profits from the costs of climate change, and to ensure that our communities have the resources they need to respond to those impacts. The goal is to actually get those resources for communities, but also to get the costs onto the balance sheets of fossil fuel companies so that investors, governments, and the companies themselves make different business decisions. It doesn't require new laws. It doesn't require us, although new laws are an option that I'll touch on later. It uses the existing legal framework to hold companies accountable. It doesn't require us to go cap in hand to government and say, please do the right thing. it's never been legal to sell a product that you know is going to directly harm people and violate rights on a massive scale, and not take any responsibility for the products. This is a picture of the Friends of the Earth Netherlands, who successfully sued Shell for demonstrating that that company was legally responsible for the harm caused by their products, and they got a court order that Shell reduce its emissions from its products faster. But there's also 28 Canadian law professors saying that there's a legal claim here. There's more than 40 local and state governments in the US that are bringing climate lawsuits against fossil fuel companies under a range of different legal theories. And the US Supreme Court just refused to hear an appeal by the oil and gas companies that would have blocked those cases going ahead. So those cases are going ahead. People power is also essential. Judges follow the social consensus, and so organizing and really making it clear that why these cases need to be brought and need to be won is critical. It's also global in nature. Most of the climate action we take is about reducing Canada's emissions, or reducing our province's emissions, or reducing our local government's emissions. Because the harm caused by global greenhouse gas producers by these companies occurs in Canada, Canadian courts actually have jurisdiction over the global causes of that harm. So you can sue Chevron for its global operations. Chevron is responsible for about 3%, over 3% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. Canada is only about 1.6%, or 1.8% historically. So this is really important because it gets us out of this like each country, what about China, what about India, what about the US conversation, because we can sue those global companies in Canadian courts. The BC model that we're proposing is a class action lawsuit that allows local governments to pool their resources. So it keeps the costs manageable. In fact, the initial ask is $1 per resident for each of the communities in BC. Also, BC's class action legislation has some advantages in that it protects local governments against having, or the parties against having to pay the other side's legal fees if they were to lose. And it's also popular. We've polled on this and found that 69% or 68.5% of British Columbians either strongly support or somewhat support their local governments suing fossil fuel companies for a share of those costs. The share is important here. No one's saying that the fossil fuel industry needs to pay everything. Right now, they're paying nothing. We need to come up with a way of holding them responsible so that they pay their fair share and that those are reflected in their balance sheets and that those resources are available to our communities. This question explicitly draws the connection between the fact that if they don't pay, that we end up paying for everything. There was also Ecoanalytics asked a similar question that didn't draw that link as tightly, but at a national level. So these are the figures nationally. As you'll see, 50% of Canadians support the idea of their local government suing oil and gas companies for a share of the cost of climate change, even without that link to like, otherwise you have to pay being made as strongly as it was in the other poll. So the Sue Big Oil campaign, as I said, calls on local governments to take action, to put aside $1 per resident into a fund to sue Big Oil and to work with other local governments to file a class action lawsuit. We have action teams developing in communities around BC. The city of Gibson's, because of pressure from the Sue Big Oil Sunshine Coast group, has passed a resolution. We're hoping to have other municipalities coming on board in the near future. I'll just close by sort of mentioning, it is a BC focused campaign currently. That's both because we're a BC focused organization, but also because the Class Proceedings Act in BC has some advantages that are unique to BC. But this is a conversation I think that every level of government and every community should be having. How can we afford to pay for these costs? First of all, the goal again is to ensure that everyone pays a fair share of climate costs. Litigation is an option, and the City of Toronto in the past has actually sought legal advice on what its options are, but there hasn't been a lot of public pressure from the outside to follow through on that, and it hasn't gone anywhere to date. But that question of how do we, I think every community has to consider whether that's an option they should be pursuing, and every level of government. We've also had communities just take the symbolic step of sending letters to global fossil fuel companies asking that they pay a fair share of their costs. The Ontario legislature is currently considering an act respecting civil liability for climate harm that was introduced just yesterday, actually, by the NDP there. And this type of legislation, which makes it clear that fossil fuel companies and others that have contributed to climate change can be held legally responsible in court, can be very helpful in advancing these issues. But again, there hasn't been a lot of public pressure demanding this, and we should, because the alternative is we are all paying for this, and the fossil fuel industry and their investors and governments continue to have an incentive to put short-term profits ahead of the health of the planet. But I think I want to also emphasize there are many, many places and contexts to raise this type of issue through Indigenous campaigns, through shareholder campaigns, through other types of climate action, and indeed incorporating this type of messaging and into existing climate campaigns. Because while we like to focus on government is ultimately captured to some degree by the perceived profits, the public perception that this is a profitable wealth-creating industry. And until we go after these industries in all of our campaigns, I think that it becomes, it's very difficult to actually achieve the results we'd like to achieve. So I will stop there and look forward to more discussion when we get to that stage.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Andrew. And that's a point that really resonates strongly with me of my years of climate action, the importance of really holding these companies and big polluters accountable for their actions and not allowing them to continue to endanger the health and well-being of regular citizens like us. So thank you so much for sharing some of your initiatives and some other ideas. So next we're going to hear from Kaitlyn Harvey, 15-year-old Sabrina Dykstra, and Dr. David Maenz from the lawsuit filed March 21st, 2023 by Climate Justice Saskatoon and 7 residents against SaskPower, Crown Investments, and the Saskatchewan Government. Welcome and take it away.
Oh, well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kaitlyn Harvey, and I'm a lawyer in Saskatoon who's been helping put this case together. And I'm really honored to be here today to discuss it with you all and hear your perspectives. I wanted to also thank Citizens Climate Lobby for hosting this discussion and inviting us to participate. Just a quick aside, I had the privilege of lobbying with your group several years ago to try to get a national carbon price put in place. We know that was ultimately successful, and I honestly continue to be inspired by your group's work. But I want to talk about our case. But first, I need you to understand where it fits in the context of this body of jurisprudence that the 2 other speakers have alluded to. Our case is novel in the context of climate-related litigation in Saskatchewan. But if we look beyond our borders, we can better understand how climate change is affecting people and the law, and we can benefit from the wisdom of courts in other countries that have faced similar constitutional rights and climate-based disputes, particularly those in common law jurisdictions. I'm not going to go into the specifics of those cases, but I will say this idea of citizens losing trust in their government and seeking redress from the court, which really started with the Urgenda Foundation versus the Netherlands case, has led to a wave of litigation that shows no signs of slowing down. And as the Supreme Court of Canada recognized in the carbon pricing reference case at the 2nd paragraph, climate change is real and it poses a grave threat to humanity's future. The only way to address the threat of climate change is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in Saskatchewan, we no longer need to look very far to see climate-related change and harm to a degree never before witnessed. We could be a world leader in solar and wind energy industries if we wanted to, but instead our government delays and squanders opportunities to participate in the clean energy economy. As a result, Saskatchewan continues to have the highest per capita greenhouse gas emission levels in the country, and our premier has made it very clear he does not care about bringing those levels down nor the impacts of failing to do so. The applicants in our case are done waiting for the government of Saskatchewan to start taking climate change seriously and assert that the government is not acting in the best interests of its citizens when it decides to go ahead with building new unabated natural gas power plants. It's 2023 and we're in the sunniest and windiest province in the country, and our applicants have no choice but to rely on the electricity as provided by SaskPower. And we rely on SaskPower to reduce emissions to mitigate the severity of climate-related harm. So that instead of investing in Saskatchewan's huge potential in the areas of renewable resources, energy development, and supporting the clean energy economy, the government of Saskatchewan continues to subsidize the fossil fuel industry and is trying to build as many natural gas plants as it can before the new federal clean energy regulations come into effect. When you look at the short and long-term costs and benefits of producing, storing, and distributing solar and wind energy power and compare that to the costs of building new unabated natural gas power plants, and the impact of the government of Saskatchewan's decision to continue contributing to harm against the very people it's supposed to protect, the numbers and the jurisprudence are there to support a claim that the applicant's rights protected under Section 7 and 15 of the Charter have been infringed, and this infringement cannot be justified as being in the public interest. You know, as Dr. Boyd pointed out, every fraction of a degree matters, and so does each additional natural gas power plant. The actions of SaskPower must be reconciled with reality, and we're hoping that Canadian courts will help us do just that. I'll turn it over now to two of our applicants here to speak more about the specifics of the case. Thank you.
Sabrina, did you want to go next?
Sure, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, I'm Sabrina Dykstra, and I'm one of the 7 applicants in the SaskPower climate litigation and the youngest applicant. I'm 15 years old, and I became involved in this litigation because I am deeply disappointed by the lack of necessary action by the Saskatchewan Government and its crown corporation SaskPower to prevent dangerous climate change from worsening. I'm surrounded by young people every day, considering that I am a young person. Nonetheless, I like to think that my youth does not make me ignorant. I know that there is an extremely unpleasant future in store, especially if climate action continues to come too little, too late. My generation and others have to sit and wait for our impending doom as we get closer to goalposts for emission reductions that very likely will not be met. I am one of many people who is terrified about the future. This climate litigation is something that I feel privileged to be involved in because I feel that this is an opportunity to add another voice to the fight for climate justice. We have been given all of the warnings and have been delivered all of the dire threats that climate change poses. People like the applicants in the SaskPower case have been trying to make their voices heard for years. However, no amount of shouting will allow them to be heard. For me personally, it is a crushing feeling to try to think of the future and realize that as we continue down this destructive path of burning fossil fuels and avoiding lowering our emissions, this world could be very different a few decades down the line. I fear for my friends, family, and for living things. Perhaps what is most frightening to me is the fact that so few people understand enough about this to be concerned. Maybe this is why SaskPower has gotten away with so much right before our eyes. It's hard to wrap my head around. Humanity has spent decades wreaking havoc on the planet and have for the most part gotten away with it. The applicants in this court case have been passionate about preventing dangerous climate change for years or even decades. I've heard them speak of concern for themselves, but also for their children or their grandchildren, which is why I am so simply astounded that not only is Saskatchewan way behind where it should be when it comes to greenhouse gas emission reductions, but SaskPower is literally fighting to reach net zero as late as possible. If this situation wasn't so urgent, maybe net zero by 2050 would be adequate, but time is running out. There are no excuses that will change the way our continued greenhouse gas emissions will affect the world and the climate. Saskatchewan is one of the biggest greenhouse gas emitting provinces in Canada with the highest emissions per capita. Yet SaskPower and the Saskatchewan government seem to believe that this can be addressed by simply switching from coal to unabated natural gas fired generation. Other provinces may be putting in the work to transition to renewables or ensure their goals align with a net zero future, but enough isn't being done here. Saskatchewan's minimal action to mitigate climate change and turn to renewables could drag down all of Canada, which is why I'm looking forward to seeing them held accountable. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Sabrina. That was very passionate and excellent. So I'm going to go through a little bit of some sort of technical things here, and I will keep it succinct, I hope. Canada, the US, the EU, and the UK have all committed to transitioning their respective electricity systems to net zero emissions by 2035. A timely transition to clean electricity is required to power the electrification of transportation, buildings, and industries under scenarios that effectively mitigate future climate change. So in Canada, the electricity sectors in each province must largely decarbonize by 2035. There are those in power in Saskatchewan that are opposed to this transition. They contend that the provincial grid is heavily invested in fossil fuel generators and mostly isolated from large-scale hydro. Their stated position is that it's impractical and, if possible, would be overly costly to transition to clean electricity in 12 years. However, the technical pathway to net zero emissions across electricity grids in Canada is clear. In Western Canada, interprovincial transmission corridors are built to link hydro and renewables-rich regions. In Saskatchewan, over 7 gigawatts of wind and solar farms are operational by 2030, and emissions would be cut by 85% in just 7 years. New build, unabated natural gas power plants are not part of this scenario. There will be a cost to this transition. About $8 billion in upfront capital will be required to build the solar and wind farms in southern Saskatchewan. However, this may well be one of the most cost-effective investment opportunities in Canada to cut emissions and build the clean electricity sector of the future. This investment can be structured such that households and industries are not overly burdened by the cost of electricity. Throughout our history, Canada has risen to the challenge when faced with an existential threat. We are not a nation that ignores reality and shirks responsibility. In 1939, the Canadian Navy consisted of just 13 ships. By 1945, Canada, with a population of the time of just 12 billion, had built the 4th largest navy on Earth. This navy was instrumental in winning the Battle of the Atlantic and thus turning the tide of the Second World War in Europe. C.D. Howe was one of Canada's greatest parliamentarians, and he served as a cabinet minister from 1935 to 1957. Based on his involvement in the war effort, Mr. Howe was nicknamed the Minister of Everything. When challenged as to the cost of building Canada's Navy, C.D. Howe responded as follows: "If we lose, nothing matters. If we win, the cost will be of no consequence. We are in the midst of a climate emergency. We cannot afford to lose the battle against climate change." Our group applauds the recent announcement from the federal government of substantial funding for green infrastructure with a focus on clean electricity. However, what is required now is political vision, leadership, and a will to implement at all levels of government to meet the challenge of transitioning Canada's electricity sector to net zero emissions by 2035. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for sharing all of that. So our final group of speakers will be lawyer Danielle Gallant, plaintiffs Alex Neufeldt and Sophia Mathur from the Ecojustice lawsuit filed in November 2019 in Ontario. It is making its way through the courts and making history at the same time.
All right, well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you all today. And I'm feeling very inspired having heard the other presentations. I'm just going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint. All right, is everyone seeing that? And I'll get started. Can I maybe get a thumbs up if people are seeing everything? Yep. Okay, great, wonderful. So here today to talk about the Ontario climate case that is being brought on behalf of 7 amazing, inspiring youth. Just a quick note, excuse me, that I am a staff lawyer at Ecojustice, which is Canada's largest environmental law charity. We have offices throughout the country, and our mission is to use the law to defend nature, combat climate change, and fight for a healthy environment for all. So this case, which was mentioned was launched in 2019, is being brought on behalf of 7 young people from across Ontario, representing all youth and future generations in the province. And they're being represented by Ecojustice, including myself, and lawyers from Stockwoods LLP. And this case is being brought against the Ontario government. So the reason why we brought this case is because in 2018, the Ontario government scrapped the province's relatively strong greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. And so they previously had targets for 2020, 2030, and 2050. They removed those and replaced them with one significantly weaker target for 2030. And this, as we argue, puts young people across Ontario at risk from the climate emergency. So how we're arguing this case, similarly to how a lot of the cases are being argued in Canada, is that Ontario's actions violate youth and future generations' rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And more specifically, we're relying on Section 7, guaranteeing the rights to life, liberty, and security of the person, and on Section 15 that guarantees equality rights, including on the basis of age. And the reason why, we are saying that Ontario's actions are unconstitutional is because we know that global warming above the threshold of 1.5 degrees will have disastrous impacts throughout the world and also in Ontario. We know it will lead to extreme heat events, wildfires, flooding, a whole bunch of other things. And we've already seen these with our own eyes. These will continue to get worse and more frequent. And we know that these impacts will cause an increase in deaths and will affect the physical and mental health of Ontarians. And why young people? I mean, it would seem fairly obvious to my eyes, but we know that the climate emergency will disproportionately impact youth and future generations. On the one hand, we know that young people, and particularly children, are vulnerable to the physical and mental health impacts of climate change. But we also know that youth and future generations will, because of the fact that they will live longer in time, bear an increased burden of climate impacts, since they will also be increasing in severity and frequency over time. And we also know that Indigenous youth and Indigenous future generations are particularly at risk given their intersecting vulnerabilities. So I'll take a moment to pause here and introduce two of the applicants that are on the call with me today, and ask them both, what age were you when you started this lawsuit, and what climate impacts have you seen with your own eyes? So I'll start with Sophia.
Yeah, hi, it's me. I just wanted to start off by saying I am at school right now, so there might be some background noise, but I hope otherwise that you can hear me. So when I first heard about this case, when Ecojustice approached me, I was only 11 years old. I had just started my own individual activism, and I feel like a lot has happened then. I was 12 when the case was launched, and I'm now 16 years old. Throughout my time of COVID and since that case, I've seen a lot of the experiences of climate change, whether that be on the news or even in Ontario here. In the winter of 2019, it was very snowy, and but also very hot at the same time. And winters in Northern Ontario are usually supposed to be like very consistently cold, but that winter it was very uneven, and the roof on our house had gained a lot of ice, and we tried to get it off, and it didn't come off, and our roof was on the verge of collapsing, and I had to live outside of my house for 6 months. And this didn't just happen to me, it happened to many other kids, many other people on our street even. And it was kind of a reminder that, even if this situation, we had a place to stay in the meantime, it was fixed eventually. There are a lot of people out there that don't have that opportunity to be able to stay somewhere when their house gets ruined by whether it be a fire, a tornado, or just any effects of climate change. And that was one of the main reasons I've continued to fight on this case, to make sure that people do feel safe and have insurance, and that, we don't have to deal with those sorts of things anymore. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia. And next up, we have Alex.
Hi, thanks, Danielle, for introducing me. Thanks, Sophia, for your great words. So I was 23 years old when I got involved with this case. Funny story, Sophia and I were in the Senate like a couple weeks ago, and she was talking about how she was in high school, and one of the senators asked me, "Oh, are you in high school too?" And I was like, that was like a decade ago or more. But thanks, I guess. Anyway, so yeah, I was 23 when I got involved with this case. And so my story of how climate change has affected me might seem a bit banal, but at the same time, I think is instructive. So I used to own a business. It was a dress rental business. Had nothing to do with the environment. I'm not a farmer. I'm not involved in tourism. So on its face, nothing about my business seems to have anything to do with climate change, right? Well, Mother Nature had other plans. So Ottawa which is where I live, has been absolutely pummeled by natural disasters in recent years. We've had severe flooding in 2017 and 2019, I think. This year, the flooding was pretty bad too. We've been hit by tornadoes, ice storms, derechos, basically everything Mother Nature can throw at us, it seems like she has. So, and this actually affected my business in ways that I wasn't even expecting, even as a climate activist. So for instance, like one time with the floods, people couldn't get the dresses back to me on time because they were shop vacuuming their basement. Or I lose business because people have more important priorities when they've been hit by a storm and the power's out. Obviously, renting a dress isn't their top of mind. So again, this is kind of a banal example insofar as, you know, I didn't lose my home. There's much more severe impacts of climate change out there. However, I think a lot of people are under the impression that this isn't going to affect them. And those people are wrong. And we need to all start thinking about how climate change is going to impact us and start acting, because we're in for a rude wake-up call. That's a little pessimistic, but that's all I have to say for now. Back to you, Danielle.
Thanks, Alex. Well, I think, you know, the cases that we're talking about today could maybe provide some, you know, some optimism, hopefully, in all that pessimism of the climate impacts that we're now all seeing with our own eyes. So just to go on about what has happened in this case so far, it was launched in 2019, and in November 2020, the court delivered a ruling rejecting Ontario's motion to strike, which is essentially, you know, an attempt to have the case thrown out, and found that it should proceed, and that, you know, it was possible to challenge Ontario's actions under the charter. And this was particularly significant because, unfortunately, all of the other climate cases that had been launched in Canada so far had failed at a preliminary stage. And I should say that 2 of those are appealing those decisions. So there may be hope for those cases still. But it was the first time in Canada that a court said, this case can proceed to a full hearing. The Ontario government did try to appeal that decision, which was shut down, and it did mean that our case proceeded to a full hearing in September of 2022. And this also meant that a number of groups were able to join our case as interveners to include important perspectives, including Indigenous climate action for our kids and Friends of the Earth. Unfortunately, in April of this year, Justice Vermette of the Ontario Superior Court dismissed the application. However, I think it's important to highlight a lot of the very important and positive findings that she made. First of all, she completely endorsed the climate science that we'd put forward and completely rejected the evidence that Ontario had attempted to put forward, kind of throwing doubts on some of the science. She also found that Ontario's climate target falls severely short of what is required to address climate change, and that this case is justiciable. And what I mean by that is that it's a case that courts can even hear, which may sound like a basic issue, but it's something that cases have so far really struggled with in Canada. But on the other hand, and the reason why the case was dismissed, she disagreed that Ontario's target is arbitrary, because she said, you know, it does go some of the way to reducing emissions in the province, and ultimately interpreted the case as asking for positive rights, and essentially meaning, you know, this is not a case about government action, but rather government inaction. And so what this means for us is that we are moving forward to an appeal as soon as we got the decision and had the chance to discuss it with the 7 applicants. You know, everyone wanted to move forward to keep this case going and you know, try to succeed at the Court of Appeal and maybe even on to the Supreme Court after that. So we've launched the appeal last month. And through that appeal, we intend to show that, among other things, Ontario is not just failing to act on climate change, and that by setting a target that permits those dangerous levels of emissions in the province, Ontario is actively causing the increased risk of harm and death to Ontarians. We'll also argue that the judge erred in finding Ontario's target to be arbitrary, while at the same time finding that it falls severely short of the scientific consensus on the necessary climate action, and that the gap between the target and the science is large, unexplained, and without any apparent scientific basis. And so I think that's the end of my PowerPoint. So thank you so much for your interest. And I unfortunately have to leave it not too long, but hopefully can stick around for some questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Danielle, Alex, and Sophia. So that concludes our presentations for today. Thank you to all of the speakers for sharing your knowledge, your insights, and for enlightening all of the participants in this call. I definitely learned a lot and am a lot more optimistic, especially from a legal framework and standpoint, as I'm sure the rest of the participants are. So we have about 15 minutes left of the call, and we want to dedicate these 15 minutes for questions. So specifically for any parliamentarians who are in attendance, you are co-hosts, so please just unmute yourself if you have any questions for the panelists. You can raise your hand, we'll pick on you, and then you can unmute yourself, ask your question. Please remember to keep your questions nonpartisan and focused on what we can learn from our guest panelists or guest speakers. Everyone else, you are also welcome to ask questions. Just write it down in the chat and submit it to everyone in the group, and then Mary Blake and I will just read them out. But for now, if there's any parliamentarians who want to ask a question before they log off, please raise your hand and we will, give you a chance to ask your questions to the speakers.
So it looks like Joel Harden can start us off.
Thank you. I see Mary Margaret also has her hand up too, my colleague from Beach CC. Nice to see you, Mary Margaret. And thank you very much, everybody, for doing this. I guess as a politician and environmentalist, I'm asking a question that falls in and outside the scope of the law. I was heartened to hear what I've heard from Saskatchewan that I didn't know about, and I was aware of the developments in Ontario, and congrats on that. I guess I'm wondering, and anyone I suppose can answer this, what are the best available cases or arguments that of which you're aware to challenge what some people are calling the new climate denialism, or the notion that we can persist in fossil fuel-based electrical production? Because from what our friends in Saskatchewan told us and what I've heard here in Ontario, and I take from the BC presentation, it really seems like the industry and their supporters are doubling or tripling down in this moment. And their new weapon in the arguments, which I'm familiar, that I participate in, is the affordability crisis, and trying to tell people that what we are advocating for, if I can use the royal we there, is going to actually make the affordability crisis worse. So what I took from what Dr. Boyd said and what so many other people said is, in fact, the reverse is true. But what I'm trying to do from where I sit is summon those arguments really deep in the reservoir of arguments to take that on. And I guess I'm just wondering specifically, Danielle, and for the Ontario case, is that going to be part of the strategy for the appeal, to basically say Ontario's latest decision to cancel our energy agreement with Quebec for hydroelectricity that just passed in April, and our plans to ramp up gas-fired electrical production as the nuclear stock is being refurbished, is and the costs of that, the costs to the climate, but also to the provincial treasury. I hope that doesn't sound like I'm flailing around. I'm grasping at trying to figure out these arguments to deal with these right-wing populists that we're always encountering, and they do get a hearing inside communities that are suffering from the high cost of living. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to all that and for your work, everybody.
That's a great question. I see Andrew has raised his hand. I don't know if you wanted to take a stab, or if you wanted.
I think I only have a partial answer, which is I do think that it's really important that we start talking about what climate change is actually costing us in financial terms. Not, obviously the human costs are massive. We can't ignore that. The Insurance Bureau of Canada and Federation of Canadian Municipalities estimate that local governments across Canada should be spending $5.3 billion, or should have resources of $5.3 billion every year to prepare for mitigation, for adaptation rather, to prepare for the cost of climate change. And I think not enough governments actually are trying to break out what they're spending that's directly climate related. It usually gets sort of hidden in increased road maintenance costs, or it's invisible. And I think having that conversation and really making it clear that this is the result of us continuing down this path is a part of the answer. It's not the only answer, but it's something that every level, if you're not, it's also very difficult to object to in terms of, if you're not trying to understand what these costs are, you're not doing good planning. I mean, we know we have these climate impacts. We have to actually begin. I mean, the Climate Institute of Canada put out a report called I'm drawing a blank on one of the last report, damage control. It's called damage control, and they actually look at the costs to the Canadian economy of climate change over the coming decades. And they have a high emission scenario and a low emission scenario. One of the things they look at is the size of government in response to having to deal with these crises. And the low emission scenario, it basically continues to get larger through the century. the high emission scenario, it actually gets higher, larger much more quickly, and then plateaus and begins to decline as the economy crumbles, basically. They don't say it quite that way, but it's actually like a really scary report coming from this federally funded think tank of academics. This is not an environmental group putting this out there. So I'll stop there, but I think that really putting the economic choice we're facing in stark terms is helpful.
I could add some brief. I'm sorry. I could add some brief comments with regard to the Saskatchewan situation here. What happened in Saskatchewan is, over the last 15 years, there's been a massive buildup of new build natural gas, unabated power plants, and this came into place in anticipation of shutting down the coal plants. So what's happened is that SaskPower, it's a Crown Corporation, has invested heavily into these gas plants, and their end of life extends well past 2035, going into 2045, almost to mid-century for some of the new ones. So that investment then becomes stranded assets if you shut down by 2035. So their argument is we can't afford to strand these assets. Mistakes, what in reality, this was a huge mistake, because you could have anticipated that these plants were going to be shut down well before mid-century, but they went ahead and built them anyways. So they're fighting tooth and nail to keep these things going to end of life. And that's the challenge here. Even though you look at it and go, $8 billion to build out 6 gigawatts, that's actually extremely cost effective. But the problem is you're going to shut down the gas plants early, and that's what the battle is against. In my mind, the mistake was made. That does not mean you perpetuate the mistake of running polluting assets past 2035. But that is, in a nutshell, the economic battle that we're in.
Sorry, I was just writing my answer in the chat because I unfortunately have to leave very soon. But I did want to say perhaps 2 points. On our case, we had put forward evidence on the costs of climate change to Ontarians to ensure that Ontario could not justify its target with an economic purpose. So that was a part of our case, and it didn't exactly go in that direction, but we thought of that aspect. And I would say we were highly encouraged by the fact that the court gave absolutely no weight to the, not quite climate denial, but climate delay tactics put forward by Ontario's experts. And so, we have a clear signal from the courts that there's no debate about the fundamental facts and science of climate change. And I think it's very helpful that we have this Supreme Court decision that lays out those facts so neatly. But we also know, at least in this case, the first case to kind of delve into those facts to look at violations of fundamental rights, that was also something that was just completely accepted. And I think that forms a strong basis for climate litigation in Canada going forward on those important facts.
Thank you so much. So Mary Margaret, you had a question.
Sure, great. And you can just call me Triple M because it's way too long. Thanks, Joel. Nice to see you here. And happy anniversary. It was a year ago today. Not being nonpartisan, but being celebratory that we took our seats. So I'm just really inspired and blown away by the stories and the crusades with everyone today, especially the youngest, Sabrina. Reminds me of the environmental club I ran at my kids' school called Eco Tigers way back in the day. And some of those members are crusading still, and some, like my own kids, have escaped to British Columbia to get away from me. But that's the number one reason I got back into politics. It's an interesting world, especially right now in Ontario, is the climate emergency, and I can't just sit still and let the world burn. So I'm here. I'm like Joel, we are doers. We want to get things done. And, we're very conscientious of the time and the battle we're up against. But I would just ask all of you, how can we help? What are the most important, immediate, effective things or actions that we can do at the provincial government, taking in mind who they are, what they're about, how they just killed my private members bill on emergency preparedness, flooding awareness. But So like we're here and we're tougher and mightier than we look. And what can we do? And if you can't answer it fully today, shoot us your to-do list, honest to God.
I went first last time. Does anyone else want to go? I think that it's absurd that the high ground on sort of fiscal responsibility has been claimed by people who want to actually impose massive costs on the world. I think to the extent possible, like framing the right-wing government's actions as or like anti-climate actions, I should say, anti-climate actions as being fiscally irresponsible, and is something that we need to do more of. And the So Big Oil campaign, when we polled on it, it cuts across politics in odd ways. We lose some people on there's broad support on the so-called left, the progressive community, but we also get significant levels of support depending on how the problem is framed. Even among Conservative Party of Canada voters, I haven't polled in Ontario for the Ontario Conservative voters, because it is ultimately a taxpayer fiscal responsibility issue.
Yeah, I mean, I've screamed to the rooftops how for every dollar invested in climate action is $3 to $8 in savings of cost avoidance, right? As per Intact at University of Waterloo, but we can do more of that because they seem to be a little tone deaf that way.
Well, this is such a fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, we're already 2 minutes before the top of the hour. So I think before we go our ways, could we take a group photo?